Thank you for this opportunity. I am Muneeza Alam. I'm an economist at the World Bank, and today I will be talking to you about the Sustainable Mobility for All initiative and what the initiative has been doing from the gender perspective. The Sustainable Mobility for All initiative, or Some for All for short, was established in 2017 when the first consortium meeting of the initiative was held in Washington, D.C. Now, today Some for All provides a premier platform for international cooperation on issues relating to transport and sustainable mobility. It brings together a diverse and influential group of stakeholders, and these stakeholders are committed to speaking with one voice on the implementation of the SDGs and transforming the transport sector. Some for All is anchored around four policy goals: universal access, efficiency, safety, and green mobility. Now, each of these goals is supported by an objective and targets. Gender is an important cross-cutting dimension for these policy goals, and work on these goals as well as gender is being undertaken by different working groups. The working groups themselves are drawn from within the consortium for Some for All. Now, stepping back a little bit, Some for All has three focus areas: advocacy, action, and finance. Advocacy focuses on tracking global progress towards sustainable mobility, of course, through the lens of the four policy goals I had mentioned. And it is supported by a global mobility report as well as a global tracking framework towards sustainable mobility. Now, the action focus area complements this by identifying the right policies as well as investments to transform mobility. And a major part of this effort has been the development of the global roadmap of action towards sustainable mobility. And next, I will present to you the work that has been done by the Gender Working Group on developing this roadmap from the gender perspective. Now, before we get into that, let me first tell you what this Global Roadmap of Action, or GRA, is. The GRA is a tool to guide country decision makers on how to achieve sustainable mobility. It's a tool that does three things. First, it allows countries to measure how far they are from sustainable mobility, and this is done through the global tracking framework. Second, it allows countries to explore various policy measures that can be adopted to reach sustainable mobility, and in this context, it develops around 180 policy measures that are relevant. And third, it identifies priority measures that can be adopted at a country level. So in this manner, the GRA allows countries to develop a tailored set of actions that they can adopt to foster sustainable mobility. The GRA is accompanied by 6 background papers, 5 of which relate to the 4 policy goals, while the last one focuses on gender. Now, the gender paper develops policy actions for gender equality towards sustainable mobility, and broadly speaking, the paper accomplishes 3 things. Now, first, the gender paper identifies and builds consensus around what it means to have gender equality in transportation. In doing so, it identifies 4 entry points where action is required. The first area of action relates to women as transport users, and here the goal is to develop an evidence-based strategy for gender-sensitive transportation that better addresses the differing mobility needs of women. The second area of action relates to women as decision makers. Here, the aspirational target of achieving 30% female decision makers in transportation by 2030 has been set. The third area of action relates to women as transport workers. And here, an aspirational target again of achieving 30% representation for women in employment within the transportation sector has been set for 2030 with an aspirational long-term goal of 50% representation. And the fourth and last area of action relates to the gendered impact of transport infrastructure. As it relates to this fourth area of action, there are 2 perspectives that are included. First is how infrastructure is designed and built, and second, how it is procured, and both aspects need to be gender informed and made gender sensitive. Second, the gender paper performs diagnostics to understand the state of play vis-a-vis gender and transport. A major challenge in performing these diagnostics has been the lack of availability of gender disaggregated data. But despite this drawback, let's talk about what we do know about the user side of the story. Now, at present, there is no single indicator at the global level to understand or measure female use of transportation. However, several country level and city level studies indicate that women and men tend to have different mobility patterns. How do these mobility patterns differ? Women tend to walk a lot more than men. They tend to have shorter commuting distances. They chain trip a lot more. They make a lot more non-work related trips. And lastly, they rely a lot more on public transportation. Now, within public transportation, harassment is a major issue. And while we cannot quantify the use of public transportation across countries by women, what we do know is that only 32 countries have legislation against harassment in public spaces, which includes public transportation as well. Now, second, let's talk about the employment side of the story. Now, in terms of employment, female engagement in this transport sector is quite low. It is something that we can measure. In developing countries, this hovers around 8 to 9%, while in developed countries, it hovers around 22%. Okay. Now, these data which relate to female employment in the transport sector is used to perform an assessment of how well a country is doing in terms of achieving sustainable mobility from a gender perspective. A similar analysis using different indicators is done for all the policy goals, the 4 policy goals, and then combined into one country level assessment. And you can see an example of how this is done by looking at the figure at the bottom right side of the slide. So these sorts of figures or this sort of an assessment will tell you how far away a country is in terms of achieving sustainable mobility across the various dimensions of sustainable mobility for all: universal access, efficiency, safety, green mobility, as well as gender equality. And third and last, the gender paper identifies and defines an action landscape. Now, in doing so, it identifies specific actions that can be taken to address each of the 4 entry points that I had mentioned previously. And it identifies specific action through a few lenses, through the lens of policymaking, through the lens of economics, through the engineering lens, through the marketing lens. And you can read through the gender policy paper to find out more about the specific actions that are proposed. Here I'm only going to cover one example. So for example, one action in the economics realm is that countries assess the affordability of public transport from a gender perspective and explore various pricing models. These pricing models could include integrated ticketing, differing prices by different times of the day, so on and so forth. And what this would allow for is to cater to the specific needs of female and male riders in a much more targeted manner. So what's next for the global roadmap of action? 2 things. First, we are piloting the GRA in select countries across the globe. And second, many of the gendered actions that were proposed under the GRA are now being operationalized under various World Bank operations, and we're encouraging other international and national organizations to do the same. And finally, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank the Some for All Secretariat and the Gender Working Group. So thank you to the program leader for Some for All, as well as the co-chairs for the Gender Working Group for your guidance and leadership. Thank you to my co-author on the gender paper. Thank you to the full membership of the working group for your inputs and your reviews. This paper would not have been possible without all of you. And of course, thank you to all of you for listening in.